I made him leave. There's a huge difference between those two things, and only someone who has been trapped inside a house that feels like a cage can understand that distinction. Leaving means you had strength. Making the other person leave means you had to be smarter than your own pain, colder than the fear running through your veins every dawn. It means you had to play a dirty game on a board that was never yours. And to make him leave, I had to put another woman in danger. At the time, I convinced myself there was no other choice, that it was necessary, that I was thinking about my survival. And survival leaves no room for guilt. But the truth, and it took me years to admit this to myself, is that I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew the kind of man he was. I knew what he was capable of when he found someone vulnerable. And even so, I pointed him in her direction. Monsters don't disappear when you redirect them. Sometimes they come back worse, sharper, faster, as if the time between one victim and the next serves only to refine the method, to adjust the approach, to make the trap more sophisticated, more beautiful, more irresistible. And this time, he didn't choose his next victim by accident. He captured her, deliberately, with the patience of someone who already knows exactly what he's doing, with the smile of someone who has seen this movie before and knows how it ends. He captured her the same way he captured me, with kindness, with gifts, with words that felt like lifelines thrown to someone who was drowning, exactly the way he did with me. When I met him, I was poor. Not just financially, although that was true too. I was poor from the inside out. Poor in perspective, poor in self-worth, poor in that quiet belief that life could be different from what it was. I was 26 years old, owed more than I earned, slept in an apartment my mother shared with me and my two younger sisters, and woke up every morning with the same unanswered question: how am I going to pay next month's bills? He appeared on a Friday afternoon at a gathering of mutual friends I barely knew. He was 10 years older, wore a watch worth more than my car, and spoke with the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has never had to rush anything in life. He wasn't the type to shout to be noticed. He was the type who stayed quiet in the corner and still made everyone look at him. Wealthy, educated, composed, generous. He liked helping women in difficult situations. That was the story he told, and it was so well constructed, so plausible, so beautifully packaged that no one questioned it. He had helped his ex-fiancée finish college. He had paid for a friend's mother's cancer treatment. He had given jobs to unemployed neighbors. He was almost a secular saint, that man. And I was exactly the kind of person he was looking for, desperate enough to accept help without asking questions, proud enough to believe I was still in control. He paid off my student debt in 2 months, asked for nothing in return, said it was because he believed in me, because he saw potential, because he couldn't stand seeing an intelligent person suffocated by lack of money. He helped my mother when she lost her job, bought me dresses I had never even dared to imagine wearing, took me to restaurants where tables had to be reserved weeks in advance, introduced me to people I had only ever seen in magazines. I thought I had found a prince, but princes don't lock doors from the outside. The first time he raised his voice was on a night I came home late from dinner with friends. It was almost midnight. I was slightly lightheaded from wine. He was sitting in the living room with all the lights off, waiting. His voice sounded different, lower, more controlled than the anger beneath it. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. The temperature of his voice alone was enough to make my heart race. I blamed his stress. He worked hard, carried a lot of responsibility. It was understandable. The first time he gripped my arm too tightly was when I disagreed with him over something trivial during a conversation with friends. His fingers closed above my elbow like clamps. I felt it. He kept smiling at the others. No one noticed. Later, alone, I wondered if I had overreacted, if I had crossed a line. I blamed myself. It was easier than accepting what I was seeing. The first time he locked the bedroom door from the outside with me inside without any explanation, while he left to handle something that was never clarified. He said through the wood that it was for my own good, that I was agitated, that I needed rest, that he would be back soon, that I didn't need to worry. And it was in that moment, alone in that room, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway, that something inside me shifted. It didn't break. It didn't explode. It simply moved, like a bone slowly sliding out of place. He had a pattern. It took me time to see it clearly because patterns are hard to recognize when you're inside them. When you're inside a pattern, it simply feels like reality. It feels like the way things are. But when you begin to distance yourself, not physically, because that still wasn't possible, but mentally, emotionally, starting to observe the situation as if you were someone else, the pattern emerges with an almost painful sharpness. He liked saving broken women, not just helping them, saving them. There was a crucial difference there. Helping is a generous act that asks for nothing in return. Saving is an act that creates debt, that establishes hierarchy, that ensures the rescued person feels permanently inferior to the one who extended a hand. He didn't like strong women. He liked women who had been strong until the moment they couldn't be anymore. And it was precisely at that fracture point that he appeared. He liked being needed, not in the healthy way generous people are needed. In a parasitic way, he needed the other person's need to never end, so his position as provider would never be questioned. If I became too well, if I fully rebuilt myself, he would lose power over me. That's why there was something subtle but constant that kept me from growing too much. A criticism here, a planted doubt there, a gesture that regularly reminded me where I had come from before him. He liked control disguised as protection. And I was not the first. I found the emails by accident, one afternoon when he was out, and I needed to use his computer to print a document. The folder was poorly labeled, disguised as work files, but something, intuition, desperation, I don't know, made me open it. There were bank transfers to names I didn't recognize, apartment leases signed with different women, emails written in that same careful tone, that same calculated kindness, those same phrases he had used with me, almost word for word. He didn't just help women, he collected them. And when they stopped needing him, when they recovered enough to threaten the dynamic he had built, they disappeared. Not dramatically. There was nothing that could be taken to the police, no obvious crime, no scene that would draw attention. They simply left, paid off, silenced with financial agreements generous enough to discourage questions, replaced by someone new, more fractured, more needy, easier to shape. And it was in that moment, sitting in front of that computer with my hands frozen over the keyboard, that I fully understood. He didn't want love, he wanted ownership. Leaving directly was not an option. It would take me months to understand that with the clarity I have today. But even back then, I instinctively felt that a simple, direct, honest departure would be catastrophic. Not because he would necessarily hurt me physically in that exact moment, although I couldn't be sure of that either, but because he controlled everything. The money was in accounts that were technically joint, but operationally his. The lawyers I knew had been recommended by him, owed him favors, drank with him on weekends. The house was in his name. Our mutual friends, most of them at least, saw him as the generous man, the philanthropist, the good-hearted hero who had rescued that hopeless girl. The narrative had been built for years, and I was part of it. The woman he had saved, who should be eternally grateful. No one would believe me, not because they were bad people, but because he was very good, very convincing, very careful about cultivating the right image with the right people. The perfect abuser doesn't look like an abuser. He looks like a hero, and heroes are difficult to accuse. So I needed to think differently. I needed to use his weakness against him. And his weakness, the only real one, the only one he couldn't fully disguise, was his need to always have someone new to save, always a new fractured woman to mold, always a new redemption story with himself as the protagonist. So the plan was simple. I would give him someone new to save, someone fragile enough to capture his attention, someone with a past heavy enough to trigger that predator instinct disguised as generosity, someone he could begin to obsess over. And when he shifted his fixation to her, I would leave, quietly, with my daughter. Yes, my daughter, the little girl he believed was his, who carried his last name, who called that man, the man who locked doors, her father. But she wasn't his, not biologically. He never knew that. I had discovered the pregnancy during a very specific phase of our relationship, when I still didn't fully understand what he was, but already sensed something was wrong, and I made a decision I would carry for the rest of my life. I let him believe what he wanted to believe, because the alternative, revealing the truth in that moment, within that dynamic, could have had consequences I wasn't ready to face. If he ever found out, I preferred not to finish that thought. Her name was Laura. She arrived at my door on a Tuesday morning, holding a resume printed on slightly wrinkled paper and references I would later discover had been carefully constructed. Polished posture, controlled voice, eyes that carried something heavy but didn't reveal it easily. The kind of person who learned early that showing vulnerability comes at a cost. She had answered the ad I posted for a housekeeper position. She had exactly the profile I needed: an adult woman, no close family in the city, a history of hardship that would make her, in his eyes, perfectly salvageable. But there was something about her I didn't know yet. She had been to prison, not because she was dangerous in the conventional sense, not because there was cold calculation beneath her composure, but because, a few years earlier, she had defended a friend from an assault. In the struggle that followed, the attacker died. Her friend, paralyzed by fear and by pressures that were never fully explained, did not testify on Laura's behalf. Fear is a powerful paralyzer. Laura paid a loan for an act that any person of character would have committed under the same circumstances. She had been released only a few months earlier. She needed stability. She needed a job that would give her a fresh start, an address, a reference that didn't mention what had happened. She needed a life. And I needed an exit. So I hired her. And I watched. I watched the way he noticed her for the first time, 3 days after she started working. The look that lasted 1 second longer than it should have. The casual question about where she was from, about her family, about what had brought her there. The same interest he had shown in me years earlier. Almost identical. The same slight lean of his body. The same voice, just a shade softer. And I watched. And I knew. The plan was working. But in that moment, for the first time with that intensity, I felt something I had been trying not to feel. Guilt. At first, he barely noticed her beyond what was necessary. She was the maid. She served the coffee, cleaned the rooms, disappeared discreetly when there were guests. He was polite in the distant way he was with any employee. But then he started asking questions about her past, about what had happened. And Laura, who needed the job and had learned that revealing vulnerability in carefully measured doses was a way to gain ground, shared selected pieces of her story, just enough to spark curiosity, just enough to trigger that predatory instinct in him. Then came the new clothes, an extra envelope at the end of the month, without explanation. A conversation longer than necessary in the kitchen one night when I was upstairs and they thought I was asleep. The same script, the same slow, methodical progression, the same web being woven with a spider's patience. I watched all of it and felt something that hadn't been part of my original plan: recognition. Not empathy yet. Empathy would have been too late. But recognition. Because it was exactly how it had been with me. Exactly this rhythm, this sequence, this careful escalation that turns gratitude into dependency and dependency into a trap. And I was letting it happen again. This time consciously. This time on purpose. The guilt grew silently, steadily, like water seeping through walls. I tried to suppress it with the logic of survival, her or me, my daughter or a stranger. But survival logic has an expiration date, and when it runs out, all that remains is conscience. There were moments when I would stand in the kitchen doorway, watching him talk to Laura, and wonder if I should warn her, if I should stop everything right there, if there was another path I hadn't seen, but there was always something stopping me. My daughter's face, the weight of my own fragility, the certainty that if I failed now, there wouldn't be a second chance. The night he kissed her, I was in the upstairs hallway on my way to the kitchen to get some water. The light was on in there. I heard his voice first, low, that specific tone I knew so well, that timbre he used when he wanted to sound intimate without being explicit. Then I stopped, and then I saw it. Laura didn't respond to the kiss, but she didn't pull away either, and I understood that stillness in a way no outside observer ever could, because I had been still like that before, not out of desire, not out of consent, but because sometimes the body learns, before the mind does, that resisting can cost more than enduring. That stillness is a form of survival when you need the job, when you have nowhere to go, when the power sits entirely on the other side. She needed that job, just like I had once needed that marriage. That was my window. In the days that followed, I moved with a precision that only becomes possible when fear turns into determination. I withdrew money in small amounts, spread over 2 weeks, from accounts he rarely checked. I gathered documents, mine, my daughter's, birth certificates, records, and hid them in the lining of a suitcase stored on the top shelf of the guest room closet. I contacted a lawyer recommended by a distant friend, someone outside his circle, with no ties to him. I packed the essentials slowly over several days, replacing valuable items with cheaper substitutes so no one would notice the gradual emptying. And on a Monday morning, while he was in a meeting that would last all morning, I had checked his schedule, knew the time, knew the location. I took my daughter by the hand, placed the suitcase in the car, and left. No fight, no explanation, just absence. I had learned that absence can be more powerful than confrontation. Confrontation gives him material to work with, to twist, to narrate in his own way. Absence leaves only a void, and a void is difficult to control. 2 days later, the phone rang at 2 a.m. It was Laura. She was whispering, not because she wanted to be discreet, but because she was afraid he would hear her. That whisper was the kind your throat produces when your chest is too tight to breathe normally. I recognized the sound. I had been that sound before. He had locked the bedroom door from the outside. The same bedroom, the same lock, the same words spoken through the wood, that it was for her own good, that she had created a situation, that he needed her to stay there while he thought. The same words I had once heard, almost verbatim, but there was something different this time. This time, the tone no longer carried the calculated patience of the beginning. The control was slipping. There was something beneath the surface that he had kept contained longer than he should have, and now it was finding cracks. Without me to focus on, without the primary object of his obsession, he had accelerated the process with Laura. He had skipped steps. The mask was slipping. I froze with the phone in my hand. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. In my plan, he was supposed to transfer his fixation gradually, and by the time that transfer was complete, I would be far enough away from my departure to be merely an inconvenience, not a trigger. But I had miscalculated. I had overestimated the control he had over himself. I had underestimated how my sudden disappearance would be interpreted as an affront, a humiliation, a failure of control that he would need to compensate for somewhere. And Laura was paying for it. She wasn't me. She hadn't had months to learn his patterns, his rhythms, the ways to survive within that dynamic. But she had something else. She had learned, in far harsher circumstances, that strategic surrender is sometimes the only way to create an opening. She pretended to give in. She smiled through the door, said the words he needed to hear, made herself smaller, more compliant, more controllable. Let him believe he had regained power over the situation, and when he turned the key and opened the door, she tried to run, but she wasn't fast enough. He caught her before she reached the staircase. And this time, without the need to maintain appearances, without neighbors on the other side of the wall, without the obligation to look like a prince, he was no longer pretending to be anything at all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay staring at the ceiling of the small apartment where I had settled with my daughter, and Laura's face wouldn't leave my mind. Her whisper, the fear inside that whisper, and the growing, inescapable awareness that I had done this, not with the intention of hurting her, never with that intention, but with a clear enough intention that a woman was now going through something terrible in a house I had once lived in because of a choice I had made. The logic of survival had completely expired. What remained was responsibility. At 4 a.m, I got up, dressed my daughter carefully so I wouldn't wake her, called the woman she called grandmother, my only real ally through that entire process, and asked her to come stay with her. I explained only that there was a problem I needed to handle, that I would come back, that I loved my daughter more than anything, and I went back. The house was partially dark when I arrived. Only the ground floor lights were on. I had kept a copy of the key, something he had never discovered. I entered through the side access, the same one I had used dozens of times when coming home late and didn't want to turn on lights that might wake him. What I found was not a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. It was a woman who had decided to stop surviving and start fighting. The living room was in complete chaos. Fragments of ceramic were scattered across the floor. Decorative vases he had bought on a trip to Europe and considered the most important objects in any room. The side of the doorway was marked. There were dark streaks on the wall, the kind of marks that happen when something is thrown with considerable force against a solid surface. The smell in the air was that specific smell anyone who has ever been in physical danger recognizes. Adrenaline, fear transformed into action, the chemical residue of a human body operating beyond its normal limits. He stood in the center of the room. The mask was completely gone. There was no serene man with the expensive watch and careful words. There was only what had always been underneath, something that only exists when no one who matters is watching. And Laura was on the other side of the room, standing, breathing hard, but standing. Not pressed against the wall, not curled up on the floor, standing with that specific posture I would later recognize as the posture of someone who has made a decision and will not back down from it. Strategic, not desperate. And in that moment, something I had assumed for months collapsed completely. I had thought of her as a tool, as a means to an end. But tools don't stand like that. Tools don't have that clarity in their eyes. In that moment, we were not rivals, not the woman who had fled and the woman who had been left behind. We were two survivors in the same room. He underestimated us. It was inevitable that he would. It was structural to who he was. He had spent so long treating women as manageable objects that he had completely lost the ability to assess them accurately. He saw vulnerability and concluded weakness, saw need and concluded control, saw fear and concluded paralysis. But he made the fundamental mistake of calculating who each of us was based on who we had been at the moment he met us. Fear had already done its heaviest work a long time ago, for both of us. There is a point where maximum fear has already been reached, already lived through, already absorbed by the body. And what remains after that isn't the absence of fear. It's something that functions despite it. Something that moves even while afraid. Something that decides that standing still costs more than continuing forward. What happened in that room at that moment wasn't beautiful. It wasn't the kind of confrontation you see in movies, with perfect framing and a soundtrack telling you what to feel. It was messy, fast, full of split-second decisions, movements that weren't graceful but were necessary, pain that would come later, after the body stopped producing that absurd amount of adrenaline that makes it possible to do things that would normally be impossible. It wasn't heroic. It was decisive. And when it ended, when the chaos gave way to a silence that felt physical, that occupied space in the room like its own presence, he was no longer standing, and the doors were no longer locked. For the first time in years, no door in that house was locked. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. The police were careful, methodical, and initially skeptical in the way they usually are in cases like this. 2 women, 1 man, a house in chaos, versions of events that needed to be verified against physical evidence. But the physical evidence told a story. And the story it told was consistent with what Laura and I described, and then the rest surfaced. Because when authorities start pulling on a thread in stories like this, they rarely find only what was visible. They find layers. They find the pattern that existed before you, before Laura, before the woman who came before Laura. They find emails that were never deleted, transfers that leave trails, contracts that carry names, women who had signed silence agreements, but who, faced with a formal investigation, realized that silence carried a cost they were no longer willing to pay. The prince's image fractured publicly, not dramatically, not in a single explosive moment, but at the slow and inexorable pace at which suppressed truths emerge when the mechanism of suppression collapses, small articles becoming larger ones, testimonies pulling in other testimonies, the carefully constructed architecture of his reputation beginning to show cracks that no amount of money and no lawyer could seal quickly enough. The legal conclusion was self-defense. Laura did not return to prison, and I did not return to that house. The division of assets process was long, complicated, and built upon foundations I had carefully laid during the months before my departure. Documents, records, evidence that my attorney knew exactly how to use. I kept a considerable portion of what had been accumulated during those years, not because I loved money, but because there was a fair accounting to be made. Years of existing inside a structure of psychological control have a real, measurable cost, and that cost deserved to be compensated in some tangible way. My daughter grew up never knowing the details of that period, only that her mother had been very brave, only that some situations require you to be stronger than you think you can be, only that freedom, sometimes, comes at a high price, but is worth every cent. Laura stayed, not as a maid, never again as a maid. She stayed as what forms between 2 people who have lived through something that cannot be fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. Not exactly friendship, not exactly partnership, but something more solid than either category. Something built on mutual understanding that requires no explanations. She lives 12 minutes away from me. We work together on a few things. We speak regularly. And there is a silent layer in every conversation that never needs to be mentioned because it has already been lived. I live quietly now, not wealthy in an ostentatious sense. I learned that displaying wealth is a way of inviting unwanted attention, but with enough comfort that money will never again be a chain, with enough space for my daughter to grow up without having to learn too early what it feels like to be afraid inside her own home. I am careful, more careful than most people around me think is necessary, but anyone who has been through what I have understands that caution is not paranoia. Caution is what happens when you learn the difference between trusting without verifying and verifying before trusting. There are things I carry that I won't pretend I don't. The guilt about Laura never completely disappeared. It changed shape. From something sharp and paralyzing into something more diffuse, something that resurfaces at unexpected moments and that I have learned to recognize and speak to, not suppress, recognize. There is a difference. There is also the recognition that I made morally imperfect choices to survive a situation that left no room for morally clean ones, that this does not make me a monster, but it does not fully absolve me either, that living with this ambiguity, without resolving it toward easy self-absolution or destructive self-punishment, is part of what it means to have walked out of that as an adult. There is one thing I learned with absolute clarity, something I wish I could communicate in a way that would truly make a difference. Monsters do not disappear. They adapt, they evolve, they learn from the mistakes they made with you, so they don't repeat them the same way with the next person. They become more sophisticated, more patient, more skilled at identifying who is vulnerable, and at what level that vulnerability needs to be approached. The only sustainable response to that is not isolation. It is not distrusting everyone forever. It is learning to recognize the pattern. It is teaching others to recognize the pattern. It is creating networks where women and men, because this is not exclusive to one gender, even if certain patterns are more prevalent in certain directions, can verify their intuitions and have the space to say, something is wrong, even if I cannot yet name exactly what. And as for the cage, no cage lasts forever, as long as you never stop looking for where the cracks are.